Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a real estate licensee in Kentucky is being asked by a seller client to help the appraiser by providing only the highest recent comparable sales in the neighborhood, while omitting any lower-priced sales, to ensure the appraisal supports the seller's desired high listing price. What is the most ethical and legally compliant course of action for the licensee? Option A. Directly contact the appraiser and inform them of the seller's desired price, urging them to adjust their comparable selection accordingly. Option B. Ignore the client's request and proceed with the transaction, assuming the appraiser will conduct an independent and accurate valuation. Option C. Agree to the client's request and selectively provide the appraiser with only the highest comparable sales to support the seller's desired price. Option D. Politely but firmly decline the client's request to influence the appraisal, explaining that the licensee's role is to support an objective valuation process, and that providing selective data would be unethical and potentially illegal, and offer to provide the appraiser with all relevant market data. The correct answer is D. Politely but firmly decline the client's request to influence the appraisal, explaining that the licensee's role is to support an objective valuation process, and that providing selective data would be unethical and potentially illegal, and offer to provide the appraiser with all relevant market data. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits a real estate licensee's duty to their client against the ethical and legal imperative to ensure accurate and unbiased property valuations. The licensee is being pressured to influence an appraisal to achieve a specific outcome, which directly conflicts with the purpose of real estate appraisals in Kentucky. Appraisals are intended to provide an objective, independent opinion of value based on market data and established methodologies, serving as a crucial tool for lenders, buyers, sellers, and regulatory bodies. The pressure to manipulate this process undermines the integrity of real estate transactions and can lead to significant financial harm. The best professional approach involves firmly but professionally declining the client's request to influence the appraisal and explaining the ethical and legal obligations of an appraiser and the licensee's role in supporting an objective valuation process. This approach upholds the licensee's fiduciary duty to act honestly and with integrity, while also adhering to the principles of fair dealing and avoiding misrepresentation, as expected under Kentucky real estate licensing laws and general ethical standards for real estate professionals. The licensee should emphasize that their role is to facilitate a transaction based on accurate information, not to artificially inflate or deflate property values. An incorrect approach involves agreeing to the client's request and attempting to subtly influence the appraiser by providing selective comparable sales data that favors the client's desired outcome. This is ethically unsound and potentially illegal, as it constitutes an attempt to mislead the appraiser and distort the market value, violating the principle of honest dealing and potentially engaging in fraudulent practices. Another incorrect approach involves ignoring the client's request and proceeding with the transaction without addressing the potential for an inaccurate appraisal. While not actively participating in the manipulation, this passive stance fails to uphold the licensee's responsibility to ensure the client is acting on reliable information and could inadvertently facilitate a transaction based on a flawed valuation. A further incorrect approach is to directly confront the appraiser with the client's desired value, demanding they adjust their findings. This is unprofessional and unethical, as it bypasses the appraisal process and attempts to coerce an independent professional into compromising their integrity. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the appraiser's role and the importance of an unbiased valuation. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding their ethical and legal obligations. They must recognize that their duty to their client does not extend to engaging in deceptive or manipulative practices. A clear communication strategy, emphasizing transparency and adherence to professional standards, is essential. When faced with unethical requests, licensees should document their refusal and the reasons for it, and if necessary, consult with their managing broker or legal counsel. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all parties are operating with accurate and unbiased information, fostering trust and integrity in the real estate market. Question 2. A licensed real estate salesperson in Kentucky is assisting a client in selling a well-maintained, owner-occupied single-family home in a suburban neighborhood with a stable market. The salesperson has identified several recently sold comparable properties in the immediate vicinity. However, the client, who is eager to maximize their sale price, suggests the salesperson focus on how much it would cost to rebuild the house today, factoring in current construction prices to determine the listing price. Which valuation methodology should the salesperson prioritize and why? Option A. Income approach, as it considers the potential rental income the property could generate if the new owner decides to lease it. Option B. A combination of all three approaches equally to provide the client with the broadest possible range of values. Option C. Cost approach, as it accounts for the current cost of construction and depreciation, providing an objective measure of value. Option D. Comparative market analysis, as it best reflects current market demand and what buyers are willing to pay for similar properties in the area. The correct answer is D. Comparative market analysis, as it best reflects current market demand and what buyers are willing to pay for similar properties in the area. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a licensed real estate salesperson in Kentucky is faced with conflicting valuation methods for a unique property. This situation is professionally challenging because the salesperson must exercise sound judgment to select the most appropriate valuation method, balancing the client's immediate needs with the ethical and regulatory obligations to provide an accurate and defensible opinion of value. Misapplication of valuation methods can lead to misinformed decisions by the client, potential financial harm, and violations of Kentucky real estate license law and professional standards. The most appropriate approach in this scenario is the comparative market analysis, CMA. A CMA is a method used by real estate professionals to determine the market value of a property by comparing it to similar properties that have recently sold in the same area. This method is best suited for residential properties or properties with a high degree of comparability to others on the market. In Kentucky, real estate licensees are expected to provide clients with accurate and competent service, which includes using valuation methods that are appropriate for the specific property type and market conditions. A CMA, when properly executed with sufficient comparable sales, provides a reliable indication of what a buyer would likely pay for the property in the current market. This aligns with the duty of care owed to the client and the requirement to act in their best interest, as outlined in Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 324, and the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's Administrative Regulations. Using the income approach would be professionally unacceptable in this situation. The income approach estimates a property's value based on the income it generates or could generate. While valuable for income-producing properties like apartment buildings or commercial spaces, it is generally not the primary method for valuing a single-family residence, especially when the owner occupies the property, and it is not being purchased for investment purposes. Applying this method without a clear income-generating potential would lead to an inaccurate and potentially misleading valuation, failing to meet the standard of competence required by Kentucky law. Similarly, relying solely on the cost approach would be professionally unacceptable. The cost approach estimates the value of a property by calculating the cost to replace or reproduce the structure, minus depreciation, plus the land value. This method is most useful for newer construction or unique properties where comparable sales are scarce, such as special-purpose buildings, e.g., schools, churches. For a standard residential property, it often overestimates value because it doesn't fully account for market demand and buyer preferences, which are better reflected in the CMA. Furthermore, accurately estimating depreciation can be subjective and challenging, potentially leading to an unreliable valuation that does not serve the client's best interests or comply with the duty of competent service under Kentucky regulations. Professionals should approach valuation by first understanding the property type and its primary use. They should then consider the availability of data for each valuation method. CMA is typically the starting point for residential properties. If the property is unique or has limited comparables, the salesperson should then consider the cost approach. And if it's an income-producing property, the income approach becomes relevant. The salesperson must be able to justify the chosen method, and explain their limitations to the client, ensuring the client can make an informed decision based on a well-supported opinion of value. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a real estate salesperson licensed in Kentucky to assist their buyer client in expressing interest in a property currently listed with another brokerage. The seller has previously indicated to their agent a desire to sell quickly. The salesperson's buyer client is eager and has expressed a willingness to make a strong offer. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Kentucky licensed salesperson? Option A. Advise the buyer to submit an offer significantly below market value to see the seller's reaction, with the understanding that the offer will be increased substantially if the seller shows interest. Option B. Inform the seller's agent of the buyer's strong interest and willingness to make a competitive offer, and inquire about the seller's current position and openness to receiving an offer. Option C. Tell the seller's agent that your buyer is prepared to pay any price to secure the property, implying a guarantee of sale to expedite the process. Option D. Contact the seller directly to gauge their interest in a quick sale and discuss your buyer's potential offer, bypassing their listing agent. The correct answer is B. Inform the seller's agent of the buyer's strong interest and willingness to make a competitive offer, and inquire about the seller's current position and openness to receiving an offer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a potential conflict of interest and uphold their fiduciary duties to their client, while also respecting the property rights of another party. The licensee must balance the client's desire to acquire a property with the existing owner's legal right to sell to whomever they choose, and the licensee's obligation to act ethically and transparently. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresentation or undue influence. The best professional approach involves clearly communicating the client's interest to the seller's agent without making any promises or commitments on behalf of the seller. This approach respects the seller's autonomy and the established agency relationship. It involves informing the seller's agent that your client is interested in the property and inquiring about the seller's willingness to consider an offer, while strictly adhering to Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 324, concerning real estate brokers and salespersons, particularly those sections addressing fair dealing and avoiding misrepresentation. This upholds the licensee's duty of loyalty to their client by pursuing their interest diligently, while also respecting the seller's right to control their property and the integrity of the transaction process. An incorrect approach would be to directly contact the seller without their agent's knowledge or consent. This violates the principle of respecting established agency relationships and could be construed as interfering with another broker's contract, potentially leading to a violation of Kentucky's real estate licensing laws regarding professional conduct and fair competition. Another incorrect approach would be to inform the seller's agent that your client is willing to pay significantly above market value to secure the property, implying a guarantee of sale. This constitutes misrepresentation and potentially undue influence, as it is not within the salesperson's power to guarantee the seller's acceptance of any offer, and it could mislead both your client and the seller. This action would contravene the ethical obligations of honesty and fair dealing mandated by Kentucky real estate regulations. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise your client to make a very low offer with the intention of testing the waters, and then significantly increasing it later, without disclosing this strategy to the seller's agent. This lacks transparency and could be seen as deceptive, potentially violating the duty to deal honestly and fairly with all parties involved in a real estate transaction, as outlined in Kentucky's licensing statutes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves first identifying the client's objective, then understanding the legal and ethical boundaries of their role, and finally communicating clearly and honestly with all parties involved, always respecting established agency relationships and property rights. Question 4. Quality control measures reveal that a prospective buyer in Louisville, Kentucky, expresses strong interest in purchasing a home, but states they have not yet spoken with a lender about financing. The buyer indicates they believe they can afford a certain price range based on their income. As a Kentucky licensed real estate salesperson, what is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Proceed with showing the buyer properties within their stated price range, assuring them that financing can be sorted out later once they find a home they love. Option B. Advise the buyer that obtaining pre-approval from a reputable lender is a crucial first step to understand their true borrowing capacity and to strengthen their offer, and offer to provide a list of qualified lenders. Option C. Recommend a specific mortgage broker you have worked with previously, without mentioning any referral fees or your relationship with them. Option D. Encourage the buyer to increase their down payment significantly, even if it means stretching their personal budget, to ensure their offer is competitive. The correct answer is B. Advise the buyer that obtaining pre-approval from a reputable lender is a crucial first step to understand their true borrowing capacity and to strengthen their offer, and offer to provide a list of qualified lenders. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a situation where a client's financial capacity may not align with their stated desires, potentially leading to ethical breaches and regulatory violations if handled improperly. The licensee must balance their duty to their client with the legal and ethical obligations to ensure transactions are based on sound financial footing and that all parties are fully informed. The best professional approach involves a thorough and transparent discussion with the buyer about their financial situation, emphasizing the importance of obtaining pre-approval from a reputable lender. This aligns with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's emphasis on honesty, fair dealing, and the licensee's duty to advise clients on matters within their expertise, which includes understanding the financing process. Encouraging the buyer to secure pre-approval demonstrates a commitment to facilitating a realistic and achievable transaction, protecting both the buyer and the seller from potential complications arising from financing issues. This proactive step ensures the buyer understands their borrowing capacity and the potential costs associated with homeownership, fostering a more informed and secure transaction. An approach that involves downplaying the importance of pre-approval and proceeding with property showings based solely on the buyer's verbal assurance of financial capability is professionally unacceptable. This fails to uphold the licensee's duty of honesty and fair dealing, as it implicitly suggests that financing is a minor hurdle rather than a critical component of a successful real estate transaction. Such an approach could lead to the buyer investing time and emotional energy into properties they ultimately cannot afford, violating the principle of acting in the client's best interest. Furthermore, it risks misrepresenting the buyer's readiness to the seller, potentially leading to a failed transaction and damage to the licensee's reputation. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to recommend a specific lender without disclosing any potential referral fees or affiliations. This creates a conflict of interest and violates the principle of providing unbiased advice. Kentucky regulations require full disclosure of any financial interest a licensee may have in recommending services, ensuring the client can make an informed decision about their choice of lender. Finally, an approach that involves pressuring the buyer to increase their down payment beyond their stated comfort level, without a clear and justifiable reason tied to lender requirements or market conditions, is also professionally unsound. This can be perceived as coercive and may not be in the buyer's best financial interest, potentially leading to undue financial strain. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing open communication, educating clients about the financing process and its implications, and always acting with integrity and transparency. A structured decision-making process would involve 1. Understanding the client's stated goals. 2. Assessing their stated financial capacity. 3. Explaining the critical role of lender pre-approval and associated costs. 4. Recommending obtaining pre-approval from multiple reputable lenders. And 5. Disclosing any potential conflicts of interest. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a licensed real estate salesperson in Kentucky, who specializes in commercial properties, has recently made a significant personal investment in a local commercial office building. Shortly thereafter, a new client approaches the salesperson seeking assistance in finding and purchasing a commercial office building in the same geographic area. What is the most ethical and legally compliant course of action for the salesperson to take? Option A. Proceed with showing the client various commercial properties, including the one the salesperson has invested in, without mentioning their personal stake, assuming it won't influence their recommendations. Option B. Advise the client to steer clear of the specific commercial office building where the salesperson has an investment, without disclosing the reason for this recommendation. Option C. Wait until the client expresses significant interest in a particular commercial property before disclosing their personal investment in a different local commercial building. Option D. Immediately disclose their personal investment in the commercial office building to the client and discuss how this might impact their professional relationship and advice. The correct answer is D. Immediately disclose their personal investment in the commercial office building to the client and discuss how this might impact their professional relationship and advice. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate salesperson to navigate a potential conflict of interest and adhere to strict disclosure requirements under Kentucky law. The salesperson's personal investment in a commercial property could influence their professional judgment and fiduciary duty to a client seeking to purchase a similar property. Maintaining client trust and upholding ethical standards are paramount, necessitating careful consideration of disclosure obligations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately disclosing the personal investment to the client. This approach is correct because Kentucky Real Estate Commission regulations mandate that licensees disclose any personal interest in a transaction to all parties involved. Such disclosure ensures transparency, allows the client to make an informed decision about continuing the relationship, and upholds the salesperson's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest without undisclosed personal gain. This proactive disclosure prevents potential ethical breaches and legal ramifications. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with showing the client properties without mentioning the personal investment, assuming it won't affect their advice. This is ethically unacceptable and violates Kentucky Real Estate Commission disclosure requirements. It creates a hidden conflict of interest, potentially leading the client to believe they are receiving unbiased advice when the salesperson has a vested interest in a competing property. Another incorrect approach is to wait until the client expresses strong interest in a specific commercial property before disclosing the personal investment. This is also professionally deficient. Delaying disclosure undermines the client's ability to make fully informed decisions from the outset of their property search, and can be perceived as an attempt to conceal information, damaging trust, and potentially violating disclosure timelines mandated by ethical practice. A further incorrect approach is to advise the client to avoid the specific commercial property where the salesperson has an investment, without a clear, objective, and documented reason unrelated to the salesperson's personal interest. While seemingly protecting the client, this is manipulative and unethical if the advice is driven by the salesperson's personal gain rather than the client's best interests. It bypasses the client's right to make their own informed decision after full disclosure. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize transparency and client welfare. When a potential conflict of interest arises, such as a personal investment in a property type similar to what a client is seeking, the immediate and full disclosure of that interest to the client is the cornerstone of ethical practice. This allows the client to assess the situation and decide if they are comfortable proceeding. If they choose to proceed, the professional must then ensure all advice and actions are demonstrably in the client's best interest, free from the influence of their personal stake. Documenting all communications and decisions is crucial for accountability. Question 6. Quality control measures reveal that a real estate licensee in Kentucky is preparing to list a property in a market experiencing a significant economic downturn, characterized by rising interest rates and decreased buyer demand. The licensee's broker has advised them to emphasize the property's unique features and potential for future appreciation to secure the listing, even if it means downplaying the current market challenges. What is the most ethical and legally compliant course of action for the licensee? Option A. Conduct a thorough comparative market analysis, CMA, that includes current economic indicators, recent sales data, and inventory levels, and present this objective data to the seller, explaining how it impacts pricing and marketability. Option B. Advise the seller to immediately list the property at a significantly reduced price based on the licensee's gut feeling about the market, without providing detailed supporting data. Option C. Focus the listing presentation on the property's aesthetic appeal and potential for future appreciation, while briefly mentioning that the market is a bit slow but will likely improve. Option D. Emphasize the seller's emotional connection to the property and assure them that its inherent value will attract buyers, regardless of current economic conditions. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough comparative market analysis, CMA, that includes current economic indicators, recent sales data, and inventory levels, and present this objective data to the seller, explaining how it impacts pricing and marketability. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee in Kentucky to balance their fiduciary duty to a client with the broader economic realities of the local market, while also adhering to ethical and regulatory standards. The licensee must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure transparency. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresentation or actions that could be construed as predatory. The best professional approach involves diligently researching and presenting all available market data, including recent comparable sales, current inventory levels, and prevailing economic indicators relevant to the Kentucky real estate market. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's (CREC) regulations regarding fair dealing and disclosure. Specifically, licensees have a duty to keep their clients informed about relevant market conditions that could affect property value and the likelihood of a sale. Presenting a comprehensive market analysis, even if it indicates a challenging market, fulfills this obligation and allows the seller to make an informed decision. It demonstrates professionalism and upholds the licensee's duty of care. An incorrect approach would be to downplay the negative economic factors to secure a listing agreement. This is ethically problematic as it misleads the seller about the true market conditions, potentially leading them to set an unrealistic price and experience prolonged market exposure and disappointment. It violates the CREC mandate for honesty and fair dealing. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the seller to significantly lower their price immediately without a thorough market analysis, solely based on the licensee's personal opinion or a desire for a quick sale. This bypasses the necessary due diligence and could result in the seller accepting a price below market value, failing to uphold the licensee's duty to obtain the best possible outcome for the client within the bounds of market reality. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the seller's emotional attachment to the property and ignore objective market data. While empathy is important, a real estate transaction is fundamentally a financial one, and ignoring economic factors in favor of sentimentality would be a disservice to the seller and a failure to adhere to professional standards of practice in Kentucky. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding their fiduciary duties under Kentucky law. This includes a duty of loyalty, disclosure, obedience, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care. They should then gather all relevant objective data about the local market, including economic trends, comparable sales, and current inventory. This data should be presented to the client in a clear and understandable manner, allowing the client to make informed decisions. The licensee's role is to advise and guide, not to dictate, and to act with integrity and transparency at all times. Question 7. Risk assessment procedures indicate a potential seller in Kentucky is pressuring their listing agent to misrepresent a property's zoning classification to a prospective buyer, suggesting the agent describe it as fully residential when it has a commercial overlay that could impact its use. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the Kentucky real estate salesperson? Option A. Agree to the seller's request and describe the property as fully residential to facilitate the sale, assuming the buyer will discover the zoning issue later. Option B. Advise the buyer that the seller's description is sufficient and that they should conduct their own due diligence regarding zoning without the agent's direct input. Option C. Clearly and accurately explain the property's zoning classification to the buyer, including any commercial overlay, and advise them to consult with local zoning authorities for clarification, even if it risks the sale. Option D. Remain silent about the seller's request and proceed with the sale based on the seller's description, without independently verifying or disclosing the zoning. The correct answer is C. Clearly and accurately explain the property's zoning classification to the buyer, including any commercial overlay, and advise them to consult with local zoning authorities for clarification, even if it risks the sale. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits a potential financial gain against the fundamental ethical and legal obligation to accurately represent the nature of real estate. The salesperson is being asked to mischaracterize a property's status to facilitate a sale, which directly undermines the core definition and importance of real estate as a tangible asset with specific legal classifications. In Kentucky, real estate is defined by its physical boundaries and legal rights associated with ownership, and misrepresenting these aspects is a serious breach of trust and professional conduct. The best approach involves clearly and truthfully explaining to the potential buyer the exact nature of the property, including any limitations or specific classifications, even if it means the sale might not proceed. This aligns with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's (CREC) regulations that mandate honesty, integrity, and fair dealing in all transactions. By providing accurate information, the salesperson upholds their fiduciary duty to all parties, respects the legal definition of real estate, and maintains their professional reputation and license. This approach prioritizes ethical conduct and legal compliance over immediate commission. An incorrect approach would be to agree to the seller's request and misrepresent the property status. This violates CREC regulations requiring licensees to avoid misrepresentation and to deal honestly and fairly. It also disregards the importance of accurate property descriptions, which are crucial for buyers to make informed decisions and for the legal transfer of property rights. Such an action could lead to legal repercussions, disciplinary action by the CREC, and damage to the salesperson's credibility. Another incorrect approach would be to remain silent about the seller's request and proceed with the sale without correcting the misrepresentation. This passive complicity still amounts to a failure to uphold ethical and legal duties. The salesperson has a responsibility to ensure the accuracy of information presented to buyers, and failing to intervene when aware of a misrepresentation is a dereliction of that duty. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to suggest that the buyer figure it out themselves, or to imply that the seller's description is sufficient without independent verification. This abdicates the salesperson's responsibility to provide accurate and complete information, which is a cornerstone of the real estate profession in Kentucky. It fails to acknowledge the importance of the salesperson's role in guiding buyers through complex transactions and ensuring they understand what they are purchasing. Professionals should approach such situations by first recognizing the ethical conflict. They should then consult the relevant CREC regulations regarding honesty, misrepresentation, and fair dealing. If unsure, seeking guidance from their broker or legal counsel is advisable. The decision-making process should always prioritize legal compliance and ethical integrity, even if it means sacrificing a potential sale. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a real estate salesperson in Louisville, Kentucky, has learned about a significant upcoming infrastructure project that is projected to substantially increase property values in the immediate vicinity of their client's property. The salesperson is aware that this information is not yet public knowledge. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the salesperson to take regarding their client's property? Option A. Advise the client to sell their property quickly without fully explaining the specific reasons for the anticipated price increase. Option B. Remain silent about the upcoming project and allow the client to make selling decisions based on current market conditions. Option C. Immediately disclose the details of the upcoming infrastructure project and its projected impact on property values to the client. Option D. Suggest the client wait to sell until after the infrastructure project is completed, without detailing the potential risks or benefits of such a delay. The correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the details of the upcoming infrastructure project and its projected impact on property values to the client. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Kentucky to navigate a potential conflict between their personal financial interests and their fiduciary duty to a client, all within the context of understanding market cycles. The salesperson has insider knowledge of a significant upcoming development that will likely impact property values, and they must decide how to act on this information without compromising their ethical obligations or violating Kentucky real estate license law. Careful judgment is required to ensure transparency and fairness. The best professional approach involves immediately disclosing the material information about the upcoming development to the client. This approach is correct because Kentucky real estate license law, like most jurisdictions, imposes a duty of full disclosure on licensees. This duty extends to all material facts that could affect a client's decision-making, including information about future developments that are likely to influence property values. By promptly informing the client, the salesperson upholds their fiduciary duty of loyalty and honesty, allowing the client to make an informed decision about their property. This transparency also aligns with ethical principles of fair dealing and avoiding misrepresentation. An incorrect approach would be to advise the client to sell their property immediately without fully disclosing the specific reasons for the anticipated price increase. This is ethically problematic because it omits crucial details that the client needs to understand the full context of the market trend and the salesperson's recommendation. It borders on misrepresentation by omission and could be seen as steering the client towards a decision without complete information, potentially for the salesperson's own benefit if they are also involved in the transaction or have other undisclosed interests. Another incorrect approach would be to remain silent about the upcoming development and allow the client to make a decision based on the current market conditions. This failure to disclose material information is a direct violation of the salesperson's fiduciary duty and Kentucky real estate license law. The salesperson possesses knowledge that significantly impacts the property's value, and withholding this information constitutes a breach of trust and could lead to the client making a suboptimal decision, potentially resulting in financial harm. A further incorrect approach would be to suggest the client delay selling until after the development is complete, without explaining the full implications or potential risks of such a delay. While seemingly helpful, this approach still involves a degree of steering and may not fully empower the client to make their own strategic decision. The salesperson's role is to provide information and options, not to dictate the client's timeline or strategy, without complete transparency about all influencing factors. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the salesperson's fiduciary duties under Kentucky law, which include loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care. When faced with information that could materially affect a client's transaction, the paramount principle is full and prompt disclosure. Professionals should always err on the side of transparency, ensuring clients have all necessary information to make informed decisions, and avoid any actions that could be construed as self-dealing or a conflict of interest. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a property listed for sale in Louisville, Kentucky, is owned by a married couple who acquired it many years ago. The seller has mentioned that they have shared ownership, but has not provided specific details about the legal structure. The listing agent needs to determine the most appropriate way to represent the ownership to potential buyers. Which of the following actions best addresses the ownership representation for this property? A. Obtain a title commitment or abstract of title to confirm the exact form of co-ownership, and then clearly disclose this to all prospective buyers, explaining the implications of that specific ownership type. B. Proceed with marketing the property based on the seller's general statement of shared ownership, assuming it is a standard joint tenancy with right of survivorship. C. Advise potential buyers that the ownership is shared, and that they should consult with their own attorney after making an offer to clarify the details. D. Focus marketing efforts on the property's features and price, deferring any detailed discussion of ownership until an offer is made and accepted. Option A. Obtain a title commitment or abstract of title to confirm the exact form of co-ownership, and then clearly disclose this to all prospective buyers, explaining the implications of that specific ownership type. Option B. Advise potential buyers that the ownership is shared, and that they should consult with their own attorney after making an offer to clarify the details. Option C. Focus marketing efforts on the property's features and price, deferring any detailed discussion of ownership until an offer is made and accepted. Option D. Proceed with marketing the property based on the seller's general statement of shared ownership, assuming it is a standard joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The correct answer is A. Obtain a title commitment or abstract of title to confirm the exact form of co-ownership, and then clearly disclose this to all prospective buyers, explaining the implications of that specific ownership type. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a complex ownership situation involving potential conflicts of interest and the need for clear, accurate disclosure to all parties involved. The licensee must understand the nuances of different ownership types to advise clients appropriately and avoid misrepresentation, which is a cornerstone of ethical practice in Kentucky real estate. The best approach involves the licensee thoroughly researching the property's title history to definitively determine the exact nature of the ownership interests. This includes identifying whether the property is held in fee simple, subject to a leasehold, or owned jointly by multiple parties as either joint tenants or tenants in common. Once the ownership structure is confirmed, the licensee must then clearly and accurately disclose this information to all prospective buyers, explaining the rights and responsibilities associated with each type of ownership as it pertains to the specific property. This ensures transparency and allows buyers to make informed decisions, aligning with Kentucky's real estate licensing laws that mandate truthful and fair dealing. An incorrect approach would be to assume the ownership type based on the seller's verbal description or the appearance of the property. This bypasses the crucial step of title verification and could lead to significant misrepresentations about the property's marketability and the buyer's future rights. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on marketing the property without fully understanding or disclosing the existing ownership structure. This neglects the licensee's fiduciary duty to the buyer and violates ethical obligations to provide complete and accurate information. Finally, advising a buyer to proceed with a purchase without a clear understanding of the ownership type, especially if it involves complex arrangements like leaseholds or tenancies in common, would be irresponsible and potentially expose the buyer to legal and financial risks, thereby breaching professional standards. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that prioritizes due diligence and client education. This involves initiating a title search early in the listing or buyer representation process, consulting with legal counsel if the ownership structure is unclear or presents unusual complexities, and ensuring all disclosures are in writing and easily understood by the client. The goal is always to facilitate a transaction based on complete information and mutual understanding, upholding the integrity of the real estate profession in Kentucky. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a Kentucky real estate salesperson is working with a buyer interested in a property that requires a significant down payment. The buyer has limited liquid capital but possesses other assets and is exploring financing options. The salesperson is aware that the seller is open to offering seller financing, and the buyer has also inquired about hard money loans. The salesperson needs to advise the buyer on how to proceed. Which of the following represents the most responsible and ethical approach for the Kentucky salesperson to take? Option A. Fully explain the terms and risks of the seller financing option, including interest rates, repayment schedules, and default consequences, and strongly advise the buyer to consult with an independent attorney and financial advisor to review the proposed agreement before proceeding. Option B. Present seller financing as a straightforward way to acquire the property, highlighting only the potential for a lower interest rate compared to traditional mortgages, without detailing the specific risks or recommending independent legal review. Option C. Recommend a hard money loan, emphasizing its quick funding potential, and assure the buyer that the high interest rates are a necessary cost for rapid acquisition of the property. Option D. Facilitate the seller financing agreement by drafting the necessary documents and advising the buyer that their personal financial situation is a private matter not relevant to the salesperson's role in the transaction. The correct answer is A. Fully explain the terms and risks of the seller financing option, including interest rates, repayment schedules, and default consequences, and strongly advise the buyer to consult with an independent attorney and financial advisor to review the proposed agreement before proceeding. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Kentucky real estate salesperson because it involves advising a client on financing options that carry significant risk and require a thorough understanding of both the client's financial capacity and the implications of different loan structures. The salesperson must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure they are providing advice that is in the client's best interest, not just facilitating a transaction. Misrepresenting the risks or benefits of hard money loans or seller financing can lead to severe financial repercussions for the client and professional liability for the salesperson. Adherence to Kentucky's real estate licensing laws and ethical guidelines is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive discussion with the client about their financial situation, risk tolerance, and the specific terms of the proposed seller financing. This includes clearly explaining the interest rate, repayment schedule, any balloon payments, and the consequences of default. The salesperson should also advise the client to seek independent legal and financial counsel to review the seller financing agreement. This approach is correct because it prioritizes the client's informed consent and financial well-being, aligning with the fiduciary duty a licensee owes to their client under Kentucky law. It ensures the client understands the full scope of the agreement and its potential risks, thereby mitigating future disputes and protecting the client from predatory terms. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending hard money loans without a thorough assessment of the client's ability to repay and the high interest rates and fees associated with such loans is an ethically unsound approach. This could lead to the client facing foreclosure if they cannot meet the short repayment terms, violating the duty of care. Presenting seller financing as a guaranteed profit-generating strategy without disclosing the inherent risks, such as the possibility of the seller defaulting on their own mortgage or the property's value declining, is also misleading and unethical. Furthermore, failing to advise the client to seek independent legal and financial review of any financing agreement, especially one as complex as seller financing, constitutes a failure to provide adequate professional guidance and could expose the client to unfavorable terms. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always begin by thoroughly understanding their client's financial situation, goals, and risk tolerance. When discussing financing options, especially those with higher risk profiles like hard money or seller financing, the salesperson's role is to educate and inform, not to provide definitive financial advice. This education should include a clear explanation of the pros and cons of each option, with a strong emphasis on the risks. Crucially, the salesperson must always recommend that the client consult with qualified legal and financial professionals to review any agreements and ensure they fully comprehend the terms and implications before signing. This layered approach ensures the client makes an informed decision and protects the salesperson from acting outside their scope of expertise and licensing. Question 11. During the evaluation of a potential home purchase in Louisville, Kentucky, a real estate licensee learns that the buyers intend to make a down payment that will result in a loan-to-value ratio requiring private mortgage insurance, PMI. The licensee knows that PMI adds a significant monthly cost to the mortgage payment, and that there are strategies the buyers could employ to potentially avoid or minimize this cost, such as increasing their down payment or exploring specific loan programs. The licensee also knows that the buyers are eager to close on the property quickly. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for the licensee to take? Option A. Proactively explain to the buyers what PMI is, why it's required in their situation, its estimated monthly cost, and the conditions under which it can eventually be removed, while also discussing alternative strategies to potentially avoid or reduce it. Option B. Focus on expediting the closing process and only mention PMI if the buyers specifically ask about it. Option C. Inform the buyers that PMI is a standard requirement for their loan scenario and that it's simply an additional cost they will have to bear. Option D. Advise the buyers that PMI is a minor cost that will likely be removed within a few years, without detailing the specific requirements for removal or the exact monthly impact. The correct answer is A. Proactively explain to the buyers what PMI is, why it's required in their situation, its estimated monthly cost, and the conditions under which it can eventually be removed, while also discussing alternative strategies to potentially avoid or reduce it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a situation where a client's financial well-being is directly impacted by a product they are recommending, and where potential conflicts of interest could arise. The licensee must prioritize transparency and the client's best interests over potential personal gain or expediency. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Kentucky real estate licensing laws and ethical standards. The best professional approach involves proactively educating the buyer about private mortgage insurance, PMI, its purpose, cost implications, and the conditions under which it can be removed. This includes clearly explaining that PMI is an additional monthly expense for the borrower, not the lender, and that its necessity is determined by the loan-to-value ratio. Providing this comprehensive information empowers the buyer to make an informed decision about their mortgage options and understand the long-term financial commitment. This aligns with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's emphasis on honesty, fair dealing, and the duty to disclose material facts that could affect a client's decision. An approach that involves downplaying the significance of PMI or failing to fully explain its implications is ethically and regulatorily unsound. This constitutes a failure to disclose material information, potentially misleading the buyer into believing the mortgage costs are lower than they actually are. Such an action violates the duty of honesty and fair dealing owed to clients under Kentucky law and could lead to disciplinary action by the Kentucky Real Estate Commission. Another unacceptable approach is to suggest that PMI is a standard, unavoidable cost, without explaining the possibility of avoiding it through a larger down payment or negotiating with the lender for alternative arrangements. This lack of proactive guidance deprives the buyer of crucial information that could significantly impact their financial planning and homeownership goals. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interest. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on securing the sale without thoroughly discussing the financial implications of PMI, such as its impact on monthly payments and the process for its eventual removal, is also professionally deficient. This prioritizes the transaction over the client's long-term financial health and violates the fiduciary duty of care. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a commitment to full disclosure, client education, and acting solely in the client's best interest. Licensees should always ask themselves if they are providing all necessary information for the client to make a fully informed decision, even if that information might complicate the transaction or reduce their immediate commission. Question 12. What factors should a Kentucky real estate salesperson consider when advising a seller on how to maximize their property's marketability and potential sale price, particularly when considering buyers who may utilize government-backed loan programs like FHA, VA, or USDA? Option A. Providing detailed explanations of the specific underwriting guidelines and eligibility requirements for FHA, VA, and USDA loans to the seller. Option B. Dismissing government-backed loans as generally less favorable than conventional financing and focusing exclusively on marketing the property to buyers using traditional mortgage options. Option C. Actively discouraging the seller from accepting offers from buyers utilizing FHA, VA, or USDA loans due to potential complexities in the closing process. Option D. Informing the seller about the general benefits of FHA, VA, and USDA loans in expanding the buyer pool and potentially attracting more offers, while advising them to consult with a mortgage professional for specific financial guidance. The correct answer is D. Informing the seller about the general benefits of FHA, VA, and USDA loans in expanding the buyer pool and potentially attracting more offers, while advising them to consult with a mortgage professional for specific financial guidance. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Kentucky to understand the nuances of government-backed loan programs and how they impact a seller's decision-making process, particularly when the seller is not fully informed about these options. The licensee must act in the best interest of their client, providing accurate and relevant information without offering financial advice they are not qualified to give. The core challenge lies in balancing the seller's desire for a quick sale with the potential benefits of a government-backed loan that might attract a wider pool of buyers or offer more favorable terms. The best approach involves educating the seller about the existence and general benefits of FHA, VA, and USDA loans as potential financing options for buyers. This includes explaining that these programs can make homeownership more accessible to a broader range of purchasers, potentially leading to more offers and a stronger sales process. The licensee should emphasize that while they can provide information about these loan types, the seller should consult with a qualified mortgage professional or financial advisor for specific advice on how these loans might affect their sale, or for guidance on evaluating offers. This approach is correct because it aligns with the licensee's duty to act in the client's best interest by providing relevant market information and facilitating informed decision-making, while strictly adhering to the scope of their licensing and avoiding the unauthorized practice of financial advising. It empowers the seller with knowledge without overstepping professional boundaries. An approach that focuses solely on conventional financing and dismisses government-backed loans as too complex or time-consuming is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and a potential disservice to the seller, as it limits the potential buyer pool and may prevent the seller from receiving competitive offers. It neglects the licensee's obligation to explore all reasonable avenues that could benefit the client's sale. Another unacceptable approach is to actively discourage the seller from considering offers from buyers using FHA, VA, or USDA loans, perhaps due to a personal preference or perceived difficulties. This is ethically problematic as it prioritizes the licensee's convenience over the seller's financial interests and can be seen as steering, which is a violation of fair housing principles and professional conduct. Finally, an approach where the licensee attempts to explain the intricate details of FHA, VA, or USDA loan underwriting requirements and eligibility criteria to the seller is also professionally inappropriate. While well-intentioned, this ventures into the territory of mortgage origination and advising, which requires specific licensing and expertise beyond that of a real estate salesperson. This could lead to the dissemination of inaccurate information and potential liability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education within the scope of their license, diligent market exploration, and clear communication about when to seek specialized advice from other professionals like mortgage brokers or financial planners. Question 13. Stakeholder feedback indicates that real estate licensees in Kentucky are sometimes unsure about the most appropriate methods for screening potential tenants. Considering the legal and ethical obligations of a licensee, which of the following approaches to tenant screening is most aligned with Kentucky's regulatory framework and fair housing principles? Option A. Developing a standardized application and screening process that objectively evaluates all applicants based on verifiable financial criteria such as credit history, income verification, and rental history, while strictly avoiding any inquiries or considerations related to protected characteristics. Option B. Allowing the landlord to express subjective preferences for tenants who appear to be a good personal fit or share similar backgrounds, and incorporating these preferences into the final selection decision. Option C. Asking applicants questions about their family size, marital status, and religious affiliation to gain a more complete understanding of their lifestyle and potential impact on the property. Option D. Focusing exclusively on the applicant's credit score as the sole determinant of their suitability, without considering other relevant financial indicators or rental history. Correct answer is A. Developing a standardized application and screening process that objectively evaluates all applicants based on verifiable financial criteria such as credit history, income verification, and rental history, while strictly avoiding any inquiries or considerations related to protected characteristics. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Kentucky to balance the landlord's desire to select the most financially stable tenant with the legal and ethical obligations to avoid discriminatory practices. The licensee must navigate potential implicit biases and ensure that the screening process is objective, fair, and compliant with fair housing laws. Failure to do so can result in significant legal penalties and damage to the licensee's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves establishing clear, objective, and non-discriminatory criteria for tenant selection that are applied consistently to all applicants. This approach prioritizes compliance with the Fair Housing Act and Kentucky revised statutes related to housing discrimination. By focusing on verifiable financial indicators such as credit history, income verification, and rental history, while strictly avoiding any inquiries or considerations based on protected characteristics, the licensee upholds ethical standards and legal requirements. This method ensures that decisions are based on a tenant's ability to fulfill the lease obligations, not on personal characteristics that are legally irrelevant and discriminatory. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing a landlord's subjective preference for a tenant who seems like a good fit or who shares similar personal attributes, even if those attributes are not directly related to financial responsibility. This opens the door to unconscious bias and potential discrimination based on protected classes, violating fair housing laws. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the applicant's credit score, without considering other factors like consistent income or positive rental history, or conversely, to disregard credit history entirely in favor of less objective measures. This can lead to the rejection of otherwise qualified tenants or the selection of tenants who may struggle to meet financial obligations, potentially leading to future issues for the landlord. A third incorrect approach is to ask questions during the screening process that elicit information about protected characteristics, such as marital status, familial status, or national origin, even if the landlord claims this information is for context. This is a direct violation of fair housing regulations, as such inquiries can be used, intentionally or unintentionally, to discriminate. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and documented tenant screening process. This process should begin with clearly defined, objective criteria agreed upon with the landlord, focusing on financial capacity and rental history. All applicants should be asked the same questions and evaluated against the same criteria. Any information collected should be directly relevant to assessing the applicant's ability to meet lease obligations and should not solicit protected class information. Regular training on fair housing laws and best practices for tenant screening is essential to maintain compliance and ethical conduct. Question 14. The evaluation methodology shows that a licensed real estate broker in Kentucky is managing multiple client transactions simultaneously. To streamline their personal finances, the broker considers depositing earnest money deposits received from clients into their personal checking account for a short period before transferring them to the designated escrow account, believing this will simplify their immediate cash flow management. Which of the following approaches best reflects compliance with Kentucky's financial management regulation for real estate licensees? Option A. Maintain a single operating account for both business expenses and client funds, using internal notes to track individual client balances and transactions. Option B. Deposit earnest money deposits into the broker's personal checking account for a few days to manage immediate cash flow, with the intention of transferring them to the escrow account before closing. Option C. Immediately deposit all earnest money deposits into a separate, clearly labeled escrow account designated for client funds, distinct from the broker's personal operating accounts, and maintain meticulous records of all transactions. Option D. Hold earnest money deposits in a personal safe deposit box until the day of closing, bypassing the need for an escrow account for these initial funds. The correct answer is C. Immediately deposit all earnest money deposits into a separate, clearly labeled escrow account designated for client funds, distinct from the broker's personal operating accounts, and maintain meticulous records of all transactions. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent conflict between a licensee's personal financial interests and their fiduciary duty to their clients. In Kentucky, real estate licensees are held to a high standard of trust and must prioritize their clients' interests above their own. This requires meticulous record-keeping and transparent financial management to avoid any appearance or reality of impropriety. The challenge lies in maintaining absolute clarity and accuracy in all financial dealings, especially when personal and client funds are involved, to comply with Kentucky Real Estate Commission (CREC) regulations and uphold ethical standards. The best approach involves establishing and diligently maintaining separate, clearly labeled escrow accounts for all client funds, distinct from the licensee's personal operating accounts. This practice directly aligns with 201 KAR 11-050, which mandates that all funds belonging to others must be deposited into a designated escrow account. This segregation ensures that client funds are protected, easily auditable, and not commingled with the licensee's personal finances, thereby preventing potential disputes and demonstrating a commitment to client asset security. This approach is correct because it provides an irrefutable audit trail and adheres strictly to the regulatory requirement of safeguarding client monies. One incorrect approach involves depositing client funds into a personal checking account, even if intended to be temporary, and with the intention of transferring them later. This action violates 201 KAR 11-050 by commingling client funds with personal funds, creating a significant risk of misappropriation and making it difficult to distinguish between personal and client assets. This is a direct regulatory failure and an ethical breach of trust. Another incorrect approach is to maintain a single operating account for both business expenses and client funds, relying on internal notes to track client balances. This practice also violates the spirit and letter of 201 KAR 11-050 by failing to provide the necessary segregation and transparency required for client funds. Internal notes are not a substitute for a properly maintained escrow account and can be easily lost, misinterpreted, or manipulated, leading to potential financial discrepancies and regulatory violations. A further incorrect approach is to delay depositing client funds into an escrow account until the closing date, keeping them in a safe deposit box. While this might seem like a secure method of holding funds, it bypasses the regulatory requirement for an escrow account and creates an unmonitored holding of client assets. This method lacks the transparency and auditability mandated by CREC regulations and exposes the licensee to accusations of improper handling of funds. Professionals should adopt a proactive and systematic approach to financial management. This involves understanding and strictly adhering to CREC regulations regarding escrow accounts and record keeping, implementing robust internal controls, such as regular reconciliation of escrow accounts against transaction records and prompt deposit of all client funds, is crucial. Furthermore, maintaining detailed and organized records of all transactions, including receipts, disbursements, and account statements, for the period required by regulation, ensures compliance and provides a clear defense against any allegations of financial mismanagement. Question 15. The evaluation methodology shows that when assisting a buyer client in Kentucky with understanding mortgage options for a property purchase, which of the following actions best reflects professional and regulatory compliance? Option A. Minimizing the discussion of loan terms and interest rates to keep the focus on the property's features and potential appreciation. Option B. Discussing the general types of mortgages available, explaining their basic characteristics, and strongly recommending the client consult with a licensed mortgage broker or lender for personalized advice and loan product selection. Option C. Recommending a specific mortgage lender and loan product that the salesperson believes will be most beneficial to the client, based on the salesperson's past experience. Option D. Assuring the client that the salesperson can help secure the best possible interest rate and loan approval due to their industry connections. The correct answer is B. Discussing the general types of mortgages available, explaining their basic characteristics, and strongly recommending the client consult with a licensed mortgage broker or lender for personalized advice and loan product selection. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the nuances of real estate financing options is crucial for a Kentucky real estate salesperson to effectively advise clients and comply with regulations. This scenario is professionally challenging because a salesperson must balance client needs with legal and ethical obligations, particularly when dealing with potentially complex financing structures that could impact a client's financial well-being. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting financing terms can lead to significant legal repercussions and damage to professional reputation. The best approach involves a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and clearly explaining the implications of different loan types, emphasizing the importance of independent financial advice. This aligns with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission's (CREC) regulations regarding honesty, fair dealing, and avoiding misrepresentation. Salespersons are expected to act in the best interest of their clients, which includes ensuring clients understand the financial commitments involved in a transaction. Recommending that clients consult with qualified financial professionals, such as mortgage brokers or lenders, is a key component of this ethical obligation, as salespersons are not licensed to provide financial advice. One incorrect approach involves presenting a specific loan product as the only or best option without a comprehensive understanding of the client's full financial picture, or without advising them to seek independent counsel. This can be construed as providing financial advice, which is outside the scope of a real estate salesperson's license in Kentucky, and could lead to misrepresentation if the chosen product is not truly in the client's best interest. It also fails to uphold the duty of fair dealing by not exploring all suitable alternatives. Another incorrect approach is to downplay the significance of loan terms, such as interest rates, fees, or repayment schedules, by focusing solely on the purchase price. This constitutes a misrepresentation of material facts, as financing terms are critical to the overall cost and feasibility of a real estate transaction. CREC regulations strictly prohibit misrepresentation and require licensees to disclose all material facts. A further incorrect approach is to suggest that the salesperson can guarantee loan approval or specific interest rates. This is a form of misrepresentation and an overreach of authority. Loan approval and interest rates are determined by lenders based on a borrower's creditworthiness and market conditions, not by a real estate salesperson. Such a promise is unethical and violates the principle of honesty. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and protection. This involves actively listening to client needs, clearly explaining the role of a real estate salesperson versus that of a financial advisor, and consistently directing clients to qualified professionals for financial advice. Transparency about the limitations of their expertise and a commitment to ethical conduct, as mandated by CREC, are paramount. Question 16. Compliance review shows a real estate licensee in Kentucky is assisting a client in understanding different mortgage options for purchasing a property. The client is asking for clarification on the fundamental differences between fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only mortgages. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates the licensee's adherence to Kentucky's real estate licensing regulations and ethical obligations? Option A. Clearly explain that fixed-rate mortgages have consistent principal and interest payments for the life of the loan. Adjustable-rate mortgages may have payments that change over time based on market conditions. And interest-only mortgages allow the borrower to pay only the interest for a set period before principal repayment begins, while advising the client to consult with a mortgage lender for personalized advice. Option B. Recommend interest-only mortgages as the ideal choice for clients looking to maximize their investment returns, as they allow for greater cash flow to be allocated towards other investments. Option C. Highlight that the primary benefit of any mortgage is the ability to deduct interest payments from taxes, and this deduction is generally maximized with longer loan terms. Option D. Emphasize that adjustable-rate mortgages are generally the most advantageous due to their typically lower initial interest rates, which can lead to significant savings in the early years of the loan. The correct answer is A. Clearly explain that fixed-rate mortgages have consistent principal and interest payments for the life of the loan. Adjustable-rate mortgages may have payments that change over time based on market conditions, and interest-only mortgages allow the borrower to pay only the interest for a set period before principal repayment begins, while advising the client to consult with a mortgage lender for personalized advice. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a real estate licensee must accurately explain the fundamental differences between mortgage types to a client without providing financial advice, which is outside the scope of their license. Misrepresenting or oversimplifying these options can lead to significant client dissatisfaction and potential legal repercussions. The licensee must navigate the client's understanding and preferences while staying within regulatory boundaries. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and neutrally outlining the core characteristics of each mortgage type, focusing on how interest rates and principal/interest payments behave over the loan's life. This approach educates the client on the fundamental differences between fixed-rate, adjustable-rate, and interest-only mortgages, empowering them to make informed decisions without the licensee crossing into financial advisory territory. This aligns with Kentucky real estate licensing regulations that permit licensees to explain property features and financing options in general terms, but prohibit offering financial advice or recommending specific loan products. The licensee's role is to facilitate understanding of available options, not to steer the client towards a particular choice. Incorrect approach is analysis. Presenting adjustable-rate mortgages as universally superior due to potentially lower initial payments fails to acknowledge the inherent risk of future payment increases, which could lead to financial hardship for the borrower. This approach borders on providing financial advice by implicitly recommending a product based on a single, potentially misleading, benefit. It also violates the ethical obligation to provide a balanced perspective, suggesting that interest-only mortgages are always the best option for maximizing investment potential. Overlooks the fact that the principal balance does not decrease during the interest-only period. This can lead to a situation where the borrower owes the full loan amount at the end of the term, potentially without building equity, which is a significant financial risk that a licensee should not implicitly endorse. This misrepresents the long-term financial implications and could be construed as financial advice, focusing solely on the tax deductibility of interest payments for all mortgage types, without mentioning the principal repayment component or the varying risks associated with each loan structure, provides an incomplete and potentially misleading picture. While interest deductibility is a feature, it is not the sole determinant of a mortgage's suitability, and emphasizing it without context can lead a client to make a decision based on incomplete information, which is ethically problematic and potentially violates regulations against misrepresentation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric approach that prioritizes education and transparency. When discussing financing options, licensees should 1. Understand the client's general financial situation and goals without soliciting detailed financial information. 2. Clearly define the key characteristics of each mortgage type, focusing on payment structure, interest rate behavior, and principal repayment. 3. Emphasize that the choice of mortgage is a significant financial decision that requires consultation with a qualified mortgage lender or financial advisor. 4. Avoid making recommendations or expressing opinions about which mortgage type is best for the client. 5. Always adhere to Kentucky's real estate licensing laws and ethical guidelines, ensuring that their actions do not constitute the unlicensed practice of financial advising. Question 17. System analysis indicates a Kentucky real estate salesperson is assisting a client who has applied for a mortgage. The lender has denied the loan application due to the borrower's debt-to-income ratio exceeding the lender's acceptable limits based on their stated income. The borrower is eager to proceed with the purchase and asks the salesperson for advice on how to get the loan approved. What is the most ethical and legally compliant course of action for the salesperson? Option A. Suggest the borrower seek out a different lender who is known to be more lenient with debt-to-income ratios, even if it means accepting less favorable loan terms. Option B. Recommend that the borrower simply reapply with the same lender, hoping for a different outcome without addressing the core financial issue. Option C. Clearly explain to the borrower that the loan was denied because their income is insufficient to meet the lender's debt-to-income ratio requirements, and discuss alternative financing options or strategies to improve their financial profile. Option D. Advise the borrower to add extra income to their application to meet the lender's requirements, suggesting they can round up their current earnings. The correct answer is C. Clearly explain to the borrower that the loan was denied because their income is insufficient to meet the lender's debt-to-income ratio requirements, and discuss alternative financing options or strategies to improve their financial profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential conflict between a licensee's desire to close a deal and their obligation to provide accurate and complete information to a borrower. The pressure to secure a loan for a client, especially when the client is eager, can lead to overlooking critical details or misrepresenting information. Maintaining borrower trust and adhering to regulatory requirements are paramount, even when faced with a client's urgency. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly and transparently communicating the lender's decision and the reasons for denial to the borrower. This includes explaining that the loan was denied due to insufficient income to meet debt-to-income ratio requirements, as per the lender's underwriting guidelines. This approach is correct because it upholds the principles of honesty and fair dealing mandated by Kentucky real estate and mortgage lending regulations. Providing accurate information about the loan denial and its basis empowers the borrower to understand their financial situation and explore alternative solutions, such as seeking a loan with different terms or addressing their income situation. This aligns with the ethical duty to act in the client's best interest by providing truthful guidance. Incorrect approaches analysis. Suggesting the borrower pad their income on the application is a direct violation of federal and state laws prohibiting mortgage fraud. This action would constitute misrepresentation of material facts to a lender, which can lead to severe penalties for both the borrower and the licensee, including fines, license revocation, and criminal charges. It erodes borrower trust and undermines the integrity of the mortgage lending process. Advising the borrower to simply reapply with the same lender without addressing the underlying income issue is misleading. While reapplying might seem like a simple solution, it is unlikely to result in approval given the same financial circumstances. This approach fails to provide the borrower with actionable advice and could waste their time and resources, potentially leading to further disappointment and a perception of professional incompetence. It does not fulfill the licensee's duty to guide the borrower toward realistic solutions. Encouraging the borrower to seek a loan from a less reputable lender who might approve the loan regardless of the debt-to-income ratio is ethically irresponsible and potentially illegal. This could expose the borrower to predatory lending practices, unfavorable loan terms, and financial distress. A licensed professional has a duty to protect consumers from such risks, not to facilitate them. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific reasons for the loan denial. This involves reviewing the lender's feedback and the borrower's application. The next step is to communicate this information clearly and empathetically to the borrower, explaining the implications of the denial. Professionals should then guide the borrower toward realistic and ethical solutions, which might include exploring different loan products, working with a credit counselor, or addressing income-related issues. Maintaining open communication and prioritizing the borrower's long-term financial well-being over immediate deal closure are key to ethical practice. Question 18. The control framework reveals that a licensed real estate salesperson in Kentucky is assisting a seller who insists their property is worth a specific, high figure and wants the valuation to reflect this number to attract buyers. The salesperson has conducted preliminary research, but suspects the market data does not support the seller's desired valuation. Which approach to property valuation, when applied with integrity and adherence to Kentucky's real estate regulations, best addresses this ethical and professional challenge? Option A. A comparative market analysis that objectively identifies and adjusts for differences between the subject property and recently sold comparable properties in the same market area. Option B. A valuation report that simply states the seller's desired price, emphasizing its potential for future appreciation. Option C. An income approach that projects potential rental income, even if the property is not currently rented and has no history of rental income. Option D. A cost approach that estimates the replacement cost of the property and subtracts accrued depreciation without significant consideration of current market sales. The correct answer is A. A comparative market analysis that objectively identifies and adjusts for differences between the subject property and recently sold comparable properties in the same market area. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common ethical challenge in real estate valuation, balancing client expectations with professional integrity and regulatory compliance. A licensed salesperson in Kentucky is tasked with providing a valuation for a property, but the client is pressuring them to arrive at a specific, higher figure to support their desired listing price. This scenario demands careful judgment to ensure the valuation is objective, accurate, and adheres to Kentucky's real estate licensing laws and professional standards. The best professional practice in this situation involves conducting a thorough comparative market analysis, CMA, that is grounded in objective data and market realities. A CMA, when properly executed, involves selecting comparable properties that are similar in location, size, features, and condition to the subject property, and then making appropriate adjustments for differences. This approach directly addresses the need for an accurate, market-driven valuation as required by Kentucky real estate regulations, which emphasize honesty and fair dealing. By presenting a well-supported CMA, the salesperson fulfills their duty to provide accurate information to the client, even if it doesn't align with the client's initial desired price. This upholds the principle of acting in the best interest of all parties by providing a realistic basis for decision-making. Presenting a valuation based solely on the client's desired price, without supporting data, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Kentucky law requires licensees to be honest and truthful in all dealings, and to avoid misrepresentation. This approach would constitute misrepresentation by omission or commission, as it fails to reflect the true market value. Utilizing the income approach without sufficient justification or data for the specific property type would also be professionally unsound. While the income approach is a valid valuation method for income-producing properties, applying it inappropriately or without proper analysis for a property where it's not the primary driver of value would lead to an inaccurate and potentially misleading valuation. This deviates from the requirement to use appropriate and reliable valuation methods. Relying exclusively on the cost approach without considering market conditions is another flawed strategy. The cost approach is most effective for newer properties or special-purpose buildings, where depreciation is easier to estimate and market comparables are scarce. For most residential properties, market forces heavily influence value, and the cost approach alone may not reflect what a buyer is willing to pay. This failure to consider market realities violates the principle of providing an accurate and relevant valuation. Professionals should approach valuation dilemmas by first understanding the client's objective. Then they must select the most appropriate valuation method, based on the property type and available data, adhering strictly to professional standards and Kentucky's real estate laws. If the client's desired price is not supported by the objective valuation, the professional must clearly explain the findings, the methodology used, and the market factors influencing the valuation. Transparency and education are key to managing client expectations while maintaining professional integrity. Question 19. Benchmark analysis indicates that a seller in Kentucky has received a verbal commitment from a prospective buyer to purchase their property. The buyer has asked the seller to hold the property off the market for 1 week while they secure financing. The seller, eager to make the sale, has verbally agreed to this request. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Kentucky, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Advise the seller that while a verbal agreement to hold the property is not legally binding as a real estate contract in Kentucky, the best practice is to immediately draft and present a formal written purchase offer to the buyer, outlining all terms and conditions, and including a specified acceptance deadline. Option B. Assure the seller that their verbal agreement to hold the property is sufficient and that the buyer will likely proceed with a written offer within the week. Option C. Draft a written agreement that states the seller will hold the property for 1 week, but omit any requirement for earnest money from the buyer, as the seller has verbally agreed. Option D. Advise the seller that they can accept the verbal offer and simply wait for the buyer to submit a written offer later, as the verbal commitment has been made. The correct answer is A. Advise the seller that while a verbal agreement to hold the property is not legally binding as a real estate contract in Kentucky, the best practice is to immediately draft and present a formal written purchase offer to the buyer, outlining all terms and conditions, and including a specified acceptance deadline. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential conflict between a client's immediate desires and the legal requirements for a binding real estate contract in Kentucky. A real estate licensee must navigate this situation ethically and legally, ensuring all parties understand the implications of their actions and that any agreement reached is enforceable under Kentucky law. The challenge lies in balancing client advocacy with the duty to uphold contractual integrity and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly explaining to the seller that while they can verbally agree to hold the property, such an agreement is not legally binding as a real estate contract in Kentucky without a written purchase agreement signed by both parties. The licensee should then advise the seller that the most secure way to proceed is to draft and present a formal written offer to the prospective buyer, outlining all terms and conditions, and specifying a time frame for acceptance. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal requirements for contract enforceability in Kentucky, which mandates that real estate contracts must be in writing to be valid and enforceable. Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 371. It upholds the licensee's duty of honesty and full disclosure to their client, ensuring the seller understands the risks of relying on an oral agreement and guiding them toward a legally sound transaction. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply tell the seller to verbally agree to hold the property and assure them it will be fine. This is incorrect because it misrepresents the enforceability of oral real estate agreements in Kentucky. Relying on a verbal promise for a real estate transaction is highly risky and likely unenforceable, potentially leading to legal disputes and financial losses for the seller. It violates the licensee's duty to provide accurate legal and contractual advice within their scope of expertise, and to ensure transactions are conducted in accordance with Kentucky law. Another incorrect approach would be to draft a written agreement that includes a clause stating the seller agrees to hold the property for a specific period without requiring a deposit or earnest money from the buyer. While written, this approach is problematic because it doesn't adequately protect the seller's interests and may still be difficult to enforce if the buyer breaches the agreement without any financial commitment. Kentucky real estate practice generally involves earnest money as a demonstration of the buyer's good faith and as a potential remedy for the seller in case of default. Failing to include standard protective measures for the seller in a written offer, even if the seller verbally agrees, is not best practice and could be seen as a failure to adequately represent the seller's interests. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the seller that they can accept a verbal offer and then simply wait for the buyer to submit a written offer later. This is incorrect because it treats the verbal agreement as if it has legal standing, which it does not in Kentucky for real estate transactions. It creates a false sense of security for the seller and ignores the statutory requirement for a written contract. This approach fails to protect the seller from potential legal complications and does not adhere to the principles of creating legally sound and enforceable agreements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize adherence to statutory requirements for contracts, especially in real estate transactions. When faced with a client's request that potentially conflicts with legal mandates, the professional's duty is to educate the client about the law and guide them towards legally sound and ethically responsible actions. This involves clearly communicating the requirements for written contracts in Kentucky, explaining the risks of non-compliance, and facilitating the creation of legally binding documents that protect all parties involved. The decision-making process should involve identifying the legal framework, assessing the client's request against that framework, and then providing clear, actionable advice that ensures compliance and ethical conduct. Question 20. The control framework reveals that a landlord in Louisville, Kentucky, has hired you, a licensed real estate salesperson, to manage the eviction of a tenant who has breached the lease agreement by failing to pay rent for the past 2 months. The monthly rent is $1,200, and the lease has 4 months remaining. The tenant also owes $100 in late fees for each of the past 2 months. The landlord estimates that the eviction process, including court costs and attorney fees, will cost approximately $1,500. The landlord wants to understand their potential financial exposure if the eviction is successful, and they are awarded damages for the remaining lease term. Assuming the landlord makes reasonable efforts to re-rent the property immediately after the tenant vacates, and the property can be re-rented for $1,250 per month starting 1 month after the tenant vacates. What is the landlord's estimated net financial exposure? Option A. The landlord's estimated net financial exposure is $2,350, calculated as $4,800 remaining rent, plus $200 late fees, $5,000 mitigated rent, plus $1,500 eviction costs equals $3,500, then subtracting the $1,200 rent for the first month the tenant is still in possession. Option B. The landlord's estimated net financial exposure is $2,350, calculated as $4,800 remaining rent, plus $200 late fees, plus $1,500 eviction costs equals $6,500 minus $3,750, mitigated rent for 3 months at $1,250/month. Option C. The landlord's estimated net financial exposure is $3,500, calculated as $4,800 remaining rent, plus $200 late fees, $3,750, mitigated rent for 3 months at $1,250/month, plus $1,500 eviction costs. Option D. The landlord's estimated net financial exposure is $3,500, calculated as $4,800 remaining rent, plus $200 late fees, plus $1,500 eviction costs equals $6,500 minus the $1,250 rent for the first month the tenant is still in possession, and then subtracting the $1,200 rent for the second month the tenant is still in possession. The correct answer is A. The landlord's estimated net financial exposure is $2,350, calculated as $4,800 remaining rent, plus $200 late fees, $5,000 mitigated rent, plus $1,500 eviction costs equals $3,500, then subtracting the $1,200 rent for the first month the tenant is still in possession. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the intersection of real estate agency duties, landlord-tenant law in Kentucky, and the ethical imperative to act with honesty and diligence. A real estate licensee acting on behalf of a landlord must navigate the legal requirements of eviction while also upholding their fiduciary responsibilities to their client and adhering to fair housing principles. The calculation of potential lost rent and associated costs requires a precise understanding of lease terms and Kentucky revised statutes governing landlord-tenant relations, specifically KRS Chapter 383. Miscalculations or misinterpretations can lead to financial losses for the landlord, potential legal repercussions for the licensee, and an unfair eviction process for the tenant. The best professional approach involves a meticulous calculation of the landlord's potential financial exposure, considering all relevant factors and adhering strictly to Kentucky law. This includes accurately determining the pro rata rent owed up to the date of eviction, factoring in any unpaid late fees or damages as stipulated in the lease and permitted by KRS 383, 580, and estimating the costs associated with the eviction process itself, such as court filing fees and potential legal representation, as outlined in KRS 383, 650. This approach prioritizes accuracy, legal compliance, and the landlord's financial well-being, while also ensuring the eviction process is conducted lawfully and ethically. An approach that inaccurately calculates the tenant's remaining lease term and fails to account for the landlord's obligation to mitigate damages by attempting to re-rent the property would be professionally unacceptable. Kentucky law, under KRS 383, 670, generally requires landlords to make reasonable efforts to re-rent the property after a tenant vacates or is evicted. Ignoring this duty and simply demanding the full remaining lease term's rent without considering mitigation efforts is a failure to adhere to legal obligations and can result in a court reducing the landlord's recovery. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to inflate the estimated costs of eviction by including speculative or non-recoverable expenses, such as the landlord's personal time spent on the eviction or anticipated future rent increases. Such an approach misrepresents the potential financial exposure to the landlord and could be construed as unethical or even fraudulent. The licensee must base all calculations on actual, legally permissible costs and damages. Finally, an approach that relies on a rough estimate without performing detailed calculations, particularly when dealing with potential financial liabilities, demonstrates a lack of diligence and professional competence. This could lead to significant underestimation or overestimation of the landlord's financial position, potentially resulting in poor decision-making and legal complications. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the lease agreement and the specific circumstances leading to the eviction. 2. Consulting Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 383, for all applicable landlord-tenant laws and eviction procedures. 3. Performing precise mathematical calculations based on the lease terms and statutory allowances for rent, late fees, damages, and eviction costs. 4. Accurately assessing the landlord's duty to mitigate damages. 5. Clearly communicating the calculated financial implications and legal considerations to the landlord, advising them on the most prudent course of action based on accurate data and legal compliance.